Welcome back, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, take a moment to imagine a time often remembered as calm, orderly, and beautifully simple. A time of pastel kitchens, smiling families, and a promise that happiness could be found in a spotless living room and a perfectly set dinner table. Tonight, we step into that carefully polished world not as it was advertised, but as it was lived. This is the story behind the image. The quiet reality behind the smile. The real struggles hidden beneath the myth of the 1950s perfect mother. When most people think of motherhood in the 1950s, a very specific picture comes to mind. A woman in a neatly pressed dress, hair perfectly styled, lipstick intact, greeting her family with warmth and patience. The house is clean. The children are polite. Dinner is always ready on time. This image has been repeated for decades in advertisements, television shows, and magazines, until it became more than nostalgia. It became a standard. A symbol of what motherhood was supposed to be. But this image was never neutral. It was not just a snapshot of domestic life. It was a cultural expectation, carefully constructed and relentlessly reinforced. And for millions of women living inside that era, it was not a comforting ideal. It was a measuring stick, one that constantly reminded them how far they were from perfection. The idea of the perfect mother in the 1950s did not appear by accident. After World War II, society was desperate for stability. The chaos of war had shaken families, economies, and identities. In response, culture turned inward, idealizing the home as a place of safety and control. The nuclear family became the symbol of success, and at the center of that symbol stood the mother, calm, capable, endlessly giving. Magazines promised that fulfillment could be achieved through homemaking. Advertisements suggested that the right detergent, the right cookware, or the right meal plan could create harmony. Television reinforced the message by showing households where problems were solved neatly within half an hour, often with a smile and a reassuring lesson at the end. Together, these images sent a clear message. A good mother was one who never struggled, or at least never showed it. What was left out of this picture was the cost. Behind the scenes, the expectations placed on mothers were immense. They were expected to manage the household, raise children, support their husbands, maintain their appearance, and uphold their family's reputation, all without complaint. Exhaustion was not acknowledged. Frustration was not discussed. Doubt was treated as failure. There was no space in the public conversation for complexity. A mother was either succeeding or falling short. And success was defined very narrowly. The perfect mother was always calm. She did not lose her patience. She did not feel overwhelmed. She did not question her role. If she did, she was told the problem was not the system, it was her. She was not trying hard enough. She was not organized enough. She was not grateful enough. This culture did not just celebrate perfection. It demanded it. Women were encouraged to compare themselves constantly, not just to neighbors, but to idealized strangers in magazines and advertisements. Every detail became symbolic. A clean home meant competence. A well-dressed family meant control. A homemade meal meant love. And if any of those things slipped, it felt like a personal failure rather than a human one. What made this pressure especially heavy was how invisible it was. On the surface, these expectations were framed as guidance and encouragement. Helpful tips. Simple routines. Easy ways to keep your family happy. But underneath, they functioned as constant reminders that there was always more to do and someone else doing it better. The image of the perfect mother also erased individuality. There was little room for difference, personality, or personal ambition. A woman's value was tightly bound to how well she performed her role within the home. Her inner life, her fears, dreams, boredom, or frustration was rarely acknowledged, let alone respected. This was not just social pressure. It was emotional pressure. Psychological pressure. A quiet insistence that fulfillment should come naturally, and that if it did not, something was wrong. Many women internalized these expectations deeply. They did not just feel tired. They felt guilty for being tired. They did not just feel frustrated. They felt ashamed for feeling frustrated. And because everyone else appeared to be managing just fine, or at least pretending to, these feelings were often endured in silence. The myth of perfection left no room for honesty. Even moments that should have offered comfort, routine, structure, tradition became sources of stress. Every task carried weight. Every interaction felt like a test. The home, idealized as a sanctuary, often became a stage where performance never truly ended. And yet, the culture surrounding this image insisted that this was the happiest time in a woman's life. That contradiction is at the heart of the story. The 1950s perfect mother was not a real person. She was a concept carefully curated to serve a larger narrative about order, success, and social stability. But real women lived beneath that concept, doing their best within its constraints. Their lives were not static photographs. They were dynamic, demanding, and deeply human. They woke up tired. They worried about being judged. They questioned themselves. They laughed, cried, resented, loved, and persevered, often all in the same day. But these experiences rarely appeared in public representations of motherhood. Instead, the ideal remained untouched, flawless, and unreachable. Over time, this gap between image and reality took a toll. The pressure to appear perfect did not just shape behavior, it shaped identity. Many women learned to measure their worth through productivity and appearance rather than well-being. Rest felt undeserved. Asking for help felt like failure. And acknowledging dissatisfaction felt almost forbidden. What is striking, looking back, is not how perfect life appeared, but how much effort it took to maintain that appearance. The story we are telling today is not about blaming individuals or dismissing the past. It is about understanding how powerful cultural images can be and how deeply they can shape lives. The myth of the 1950s perfect mother was not harmless nostalgia. It was a standard that demanded constant emotional labor, often without recognition. And yet, within that pressure, there was resilience. Despite the expectations, despite the silence, real women found ways to endure. They adapted. They created meaning where they could. They found humor in imperfection, even if they could not openly admit it. Their strength did not come from perfection, it came from persistence. As we move deeper into this story, we will explore what daily life actually felt like beneath the polished surface. Not the advertisements. Not the magazine covers. But the lived experience, the routines, the stress, the quiet victories, and the unspoken costs. Because the truth is, the most important stories are rarely the ones that look perfect. They are the ones that reveal what it took to keep going when perfection was never really possible. And that is where our journey truly begins. Long before the sun touched the edges of quiet suburban streets, the day had already begun for countless mothers. In the cultural imagination of the 1950s, waking early was not simply a habit, it was a moral requirement. The alarm clock ringing before dawn symbolized discipline, responsibility, and devotion to family. To rise early was to prove one's worth, not just as a parent, but as a woman fulfilling her assigned role in society. Sleeping in, even briefly, carried an unspoken accusation of laziness or failure. Morning light revealed kitchens that were expected to hum with purpose. Coffee brewed, stoves warmed, and lunches took shape under the pressure of time. These hours before school and work were framed as the most important of the day, when a mother's competence was silently judged. An orderly morning was seen as evidence of a well-run household, while any sign of disorder hinted at personal shortcomings. The early hours became a test, repeated every day, with no allowance for fatigue or imperfection. Cultural messages reinforced this expectation relentlessly. Advertisements, magazines, and advice columns praised women who greeted dawn with energy and grace. Images showed mothers smiling effortlessly as they prepared breakfast in spotless kitchens, already dressed and composed. These portrayals suggested that a good mother not only woke early but did so cheerfully, without complaint. Exhaustion was invisible in these narratives, erased in favor of idealized productivity. In reality, early rising often began with a sense of dread. The quiet moments before the household woke were not peaceful but heavy with anticipation. There was a mental inventory of tasks waiting to be completed, mistakes to avoid, and appearances to maintain. A single forgotten item, a missing lunchbox, wrinkled shirt, or late arrival could feel like a public failure. The clock on the wall became a constant reminder that time was never enough. Sleep deprivation was normalized, even celebrated. Mothers were expected to function efficiently regardless of how little rest they received. Late nights spent cleaning, sewing, or worrying were followed by early mornings with no recovery in between. Fatigue was framed as part of the job, something to endure quietly. To admit exhaustion was to risk being seen as incapable or ungrateful. This pressure extended beyond the home. The timing of a mother's morning routine affected how she was perceived by neighbors, teachers, and other parents. Being seen rushing out the door or arriving late to school drop-off invited silent judgment. Early rising, by contrast, allowed for a controlled presentation, hair neatly styled, children organized, demeanor calm. These outward signs mattered, even when they masked inner strain. The idea that morality could be measured by punctuality and productivity placed an enormous burden on women. It suggested that character was proven through constant readiness and self-denial. There was no recognition of individual circumstances, health, or emotional well-being. Every morning reset the expectations, regardless of how difficult the previous day had been. Early mornings also reinforced a hierarchy within the household. Mothers were expected to rise before everyone else, ensuring that the needs of others were met first. Breakfast was prepared for the family, lunches packed, clothing laid out, all before taking a moment for themselves if that moment ever came. This pattern reinforced the belief that a mother's time and energy were not her own. Over time, the ritual of early rising shaped identity. Many women internalized the idea that their value depended on how efficiently they managed these hours. Success brought a fleeting sense of accomplishment, while failure lingered as guilt. The morning routine became less about practicality and more about proving worth, day after day. Yet the standards were impossible to maintain consistently. Children got sick, appliances broke, and unexpected events disrupted even the most carefully planned mornings. When these disruptions occurred, the blame often fell inward. Rather than questioning the unrealistic expectations, mothers were encouraged to try harder, wake earlier, and do more. This cycle of self-judgment was reinforced by silence. Rarely did women openly discuss how exhausting these expectations were. Public conversations focused on solutions and tips for efficiency, not on questioning the system itself. As a result, many believed they were alone in their struggles, unaware that others felt the same pressure. Early rising was presented as a choice, but in practice, it was an obligation shaped by social norms. Opting out was not truly possible without consequences. To sleep later was to risk being labeled careless or selfish. The freedom to rest was overshadowed by the fear of judgment. The legacy of this mindset extended beyond the 1950s. The association between early rising and moral worth has lingered in cultural attitudes toward productivity and parenting. Even as roles and expectations have evolved, echoes of this belief remain, shaping how people view rest, effort, and value. By examining the significance placed on early mornings, a deeper truth emerges. These hours were not just about managing time. They were about control over appearance, perception, and identity. The demand to wake early became a symbol of a broader expectation, that mothers should always be prepared, always capable, and always willing to sacrifice themselves for an ideal that few could realistically achieve. In understanding this, the myth of effortless perfection begins to unravel. Behind every early alarm was a human being navigating fatigue, responsibility, and the constant pressure to meet an invisible standard. The day may have begun before sunrise, but the weight of expectation had never truly lifted. Beneath the outward appearance of routine and order, mornings were often fueled by quiet anxiety. From the moment consciousness returned, thoughts raced ahead of actions. There was an immediate awareness of everything that could go wrong before the day had even begun. Forgotten homework, mismatched socks, unwashed dishes, or a child's bad mood all carried the potential to spiral into something larger. These were not just minor inconveniences. They felt like reflections of personal failure. Anxiety did not announce itself loudly. It lived in subtle gestures: the quick glance at the clock, the sharp intake of breath when a sound interrupted concentration, the tension carried in shoulders and jaw. Each morning was a balancing act between time, expectations, and unpredictable human behavior. Control was fragile, and the fear of losing it hovered constantly. The pressure to maintain composure intensified this inner unrest. Emotional regulation was expected at all times. Frustration, irritation, or fear had to be swallowed quickly, hidden behind calm instructions and forced patience. There was no room for visible distress. A mother was supposed to be the emotional anchor of the household, steady regardless of circumstances. This expectation left little space to process her own feelings. Small disruptions carried outsized emotional weight. A spilled glass of milk or a missing shoe could trigger a surge of stress disproportionate to the event itself. These moments symbolized the thin margin for error. When time was limited and expectations were rigid, even trivial setbacks felt threatening. The reaction was rarely about the object or task; it was about the fear of falling behind and being judged. Social comparison magnified this anxiety. Images from magazines and television suggested that other households ran smoothly, free from chaos. The absence of visible struggle in these portrayals created the illusion that competence was universal. When reality failed to match this image, self-doubt grew. The question was never whether the standard was unrealistic, but why one seemed unable to meet it. Anxiety also stemmed from anticipation rather than experience. Long before a potential problem occurred, it was already being rehearsed mentally. There was a constant scanning for what might be forgotten or overlooked. This mental load was invisible yet exhausting. It required sustained attention and vigilance, leaving little mental space for rest or spontaneity. The morning routine became a series of checkpoints. Each completed task brought temporary relief, followed immediately by concern for the next. Success was fragile and fleeting. There was no moment to feel fully accomplished because the day was just beginning, and more demands lay ahead. Anxiety was not resolved. It was merely postponed. Children, sensitive to emotional cues, often absorbed this tension. Even without explicit words, they sensed urgency and pressure. This created a feedback loop where stress increased on both sides. Attempts to keep everything on schedule sometimes resulted in sharper tones or rushed interactions, followed by guilt once the moment passed. The fear of judgment extended beyond the household. Teachers, neighbors, and other parents represented an unseen audience. Even when no one was watching, the possibility that someone might notice a mistake influenced behavior. Anxiety thrived in this imagined scrutiny. It shaped decisions about clothing, punctuality, and presentation, turning ordinary mornings into performances. There was also anxiety rooted in long-term consequences. Each morning felt like part of a larger narrative about success, discipline, and character. A child being late or unprepared was seen not just as a single incident but as a potential sign of deeper inadequacy. This magnified the emotional stakes of routine tasks. Rest was often mistaken for risk. Slowing down or pausing to breathe felt dangerous when time was scarce. Anxiety discouraged stillness, pushing constant motion instead. Even moments that could have been calm were filled with mental checklists and contingency plans. This persistent state of alertness took a toll. Over time, it blurred the line between necessity and habit. Anxiety became normalized, woven into the fabric of daily life. Many women no longer recognized it as something external imposed upon them. It felt like a natural part of responsibility. Yet this anxiety was not a personal flaw. It was a predictable response to unrealistic expectations combined with limited support. The demand to manage everything perfectly, quietly, and consistently created conditions where anxiety could thrive. It was not the result of weakness, but of carrying too much alone. Silence reinforced the cycle. Because anxiety was rarely discussed openly, it remained individualized rather than recognized as a shared experience. Each person assumed others were coping better, reinforcing isolation. The lack of language around emotional strain made it harder to challenge the system producing it. Over time, this hidden anxiety shaped identity. Being constantly alert and prepared became part of how competence was defined. Calmness was performative, masking the effort required to maintain it. The absence of visible breakdowns was interpreted as success, even when it came at a personal cost. Understanding this layer of everyday anxiety reveals a deeper truth about these mornings. They were not simply busy, they were emotionally charged spaces shaped by fear of failure and desire for approval. The surface may have appeared controlled, but underneath was a constant negotiation between expectations and human limits. By acknowledging this, the narrative shifts. What once seemed like minor stress becomes evidence of a broader emotional burden. The morning routine was not just about logistics, it was about navigating pressure that had nowhere to go. In recognizing this, the experience moves from private struggle to shared reality, opening the door to a more honest understanding of what those mornings truly demanded. From the outside, the morning routine was meant to look smooth and predictable. The image presented to the world suggested a sequence of well-timed actions, children waking on cue, breakfast served neatly, lunches packed without rush, and everyone leaving the house on schedule. This appearance of order was praised as evidence of competence and care. Yet behind closed doors, these mornings were rarely calm. They were crowded with overlapping demands, competing needs, and constant improvisation. Chaos often began the moment the household stirred. Children woke at different speeds, each carrying their own emotions into the day. One might be groggy and unresponsive, another restless and distracted. These differences required immediate adjustment. Instructions had to be repeated, encouragement offered, frustration contained. All of this unfolded under the pressure of time, turning ordinary interactions into negotiations. The kitchen became the center of this controlled disorder. Multiple tasks competed for attention at once. Food needed to be prepared while backpacks were checked, clothing adjusted, and last-minute questions answered. Sounds overlapped: running water, clinking dishes, voices calling from other rooms. The space felt crowded not just physically, but mentally. Every action demanded focus, yet interruptions were constant. Mistakes were inevitable. Toast burned, milk spilled, or an item was forgotten until the last moment. Each small error threatened to disrupt the fragile schedule. Recovery required quick thinking and emotional restraint. There was no time to dwell on frustration. The goal was always to restore momentum and move forward, even if it meant ignoring personal irritation or fatigue. The expectation of perfection intensified the chaos. Because the outcome was supposed to look effortless, the work required to manage disorder had to remain invisible. Struggle could not be acknowledged openly. This created a paradox: the more chaotic the reality, the more controlled the appearance needed to be. Maintaining this balance demanded constant self-monitoring. Children's needs rarely aligned with the clock. Hunger, reluctance, curiosity, and distraction all operated on their own timelines. Adjusting to these rhythms while still meeting external schedules required flexibility that was rarely recognized. The ability to absorb disruption without visible reaction became a measure of success. The emotional labor involved was significant. Calm instructions had to be delivered even when patience was wearing thin. Encouragement replaced irritation. Reassurance masked urgency. This emotional management was as demanding as the physical tasks, yet it went unnoticed. The visible outcome mattered more than the internal cost. Outside influences added another layer of pressure. School start times, work schedules, and social expectations left little room for variation. The morning routine was not designed around human needs, but around institutional timetables. Any deviation risked consequences, reinforcing the need to keep chaos contained. Preparation the night before was often framed as the solution, but it rarely eliminated disorder entirely. Clothes laid out and lunches planned could still be undone by unexpected events. This unpredictability meant that readiness was never complete. The day began with the understanding that something might go wrong, and that managing it would fall to one person. The contrast between public narratives and private reality deepened the strain. Media representations showed mornings as light-filled and serene. These images suggested that success was a matter of attitude and organization. When lived experience failed to match this ideal, the discrepancy was internalized as personal inadequacy rather than recognized as a flaw in the expectation itself. Time pressure distorted perception. Minutes felt compressed, and priorities shifted rapidly. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes without reflection. In this environment, there was little space for connection or enjoyment. Interactions became transactional, focused on efficiency rather than presence. Despite the intensity, moments of care persisted. A quick adjustment of a collar, a reminder spoken gently, a reassuring touch before leaving the house. These small acts often went unnoticed, yet they represented an effort to maintain warmth with an urgency. They were evidence of resilience rather than ease. As the household emptied, the chaos did not simply disappear. Its residue lingered in the form of fatigue and mental clutter. There was rarely a sense of completion, only transition. The success of the morning was judged by absence of disaster rather than by any positive experience. Over time, this pattern shaped expectations. Chaos was anticipated, managed, and hidden. The ability to navigate disorder without exposing it became a learned skill. It was not taught explicitly, but absorbed through repetition and necessity. The hidden nature of this chaos contributed to misunderstanding. Because the work of managing it was invisible, it was undervalued. The absence of visible struggle was mistaken for simplicity. This misunderstanding reinforced unrealistic standards and minimized the effort required to meet them. Recognizing the chaos behind these routines changes how they are understood. What appeared orderly was often the result of constant adjustment and emotional regulation. The calm surface concealed a dynamic process shaped by unpredictability and constraint. This reframing reveals that the morning routine was less about discipline and more about adaptability. Success depended not on strict control, but on the ability to respond quickly and compassionately under pressure. The true work lay not in following a script, but in rewriting it moment by moment. By acknowledging the hidden chaos, the narrative shifts away from perfection and toward realism. These mornings were not failures when they felt overwhelming. They were complex systems operating under strain. Understanding this allows space for empathy where judgment once prevailed. In seeing the morning routine as a site of constant negotiation rather than effortless order, the myth begins to dissolve. What remains is a clearer picture of the labor involved: quiet, persistent, and largely unseen. The chaos was never a sign of inadequacy. It was simply the reality behind the image. In the midst of hurried mornings and competing responsibilities, appearance took on a meaning far greater than simple self-care. It became a form of protection. A carefully applied layer of makeup, neatly styled hair, and well-chosen clothing acted as armor against judgment, signaling competence and control even when exhaustion lingered beneath the surface. Presentation mattered not because of vanity, but because it shaped how the world responded. The expectation to look composed was relentless. No matter how rushed or chaotic the morning had been, stepping outside the home required a visible transformation. This shift was not about personal expression. It was about meeting an unspoken standard. A polished appearance suggested that everything inside the household was equally orderly. It reassured others that responsibilities were being handled correctly. Small rituals carried significant weight. Lipstick applied quickly in the mirror, hair smoothed into place, clothing adjusted just enough to appear intentional. These actions were often the last steps before leaving the house, performed under time pressure. Despite their brevity, they served an important psychological function. They marked the transition from private struggle to public performance. The cost of neglecting appearance felt high. Being seen without makeup or in wrinkled clothing invited assumptions that extended far beyond the surface. It could suggest disorganization, fatigue, or lack of effort. In a culture that equated outward polish with inner discipline, these assumptions carried moral undertones. Appearance became shorthand for character. This pressure intensified in social spaces tied to children's lives. School entrances, neighborhood sidewalks, and brief encounters with other parents functioned as stages for comparison. Even fleeting interactions carried weight. A glance, a nod, or a passing comment could reinforce feelings of adequacy or doubt. Looking put together offered a measure of control in these moments. Media representations amplified these expectations. Advertisements and magazines consistently portrayed mothers as stylish and serene, effortlessly balancing beauty with responsibility. These images suggested that maintaining appearance was simply part of the role, achievable with the right products or attitude. The labor behind this presentation was never shown. In reality, maintaining appearance required planning and sacrifice. Time spent grooming was time taken from rest or other tasks. Choices had to be made about where to allocate limited energy. Often, appearance was prioritized because of its perceived impact on how others would judge the entire household. The focus on appearance also served as a distraction from deeper challenges. Compliments about looking well could momentarily mask exhaustion or stress. They offered validation that something was being done right, even when internal resources felt depleted. This external reassurance became a substitute for genuine support. Children absorbed these cues as well. They learned that looking presentable mattered, not just for themselves but as a reflection of family life. Clothing and grooming became associated with respectability and acceptance. These lessons were rarely articulated directly, but reinforced through repetition and observation. The emphasis on appearance reinforced gendered expectations. While others in the household could leave with minimal preparation, the responsibility to represent the family visually fell disproportionately on mothers. Their appearance was seen as a public statement, carrying implications beyond individual preference. Moments of resistance were rare and often costly. Choosing comfort over polish risked scrutiny or self-doubt. Even when no one commented, internalized standards filled the silence. The mirror became a site of negotiation between authenticity and expectation. Over time, this constant attention to appearance shaped self-perception. Identity became intertwined with presentation. Feeling unprepared externally could trigger feelings of inadequacy internally. The boundary between how one looked and who one was blurred. Yet within these routines, there was also agency. Appearance could be used strategically, offering a sense of control in environments where much felt unpredictable. Choosing how to present oneself, even within constraints, allowed for small expressions of autonomy. Understanding appearance as armor reframes its role. It was not about superficiality, but survival within a judgment-driven culture. The effort invested in looking composed was a response to scrutiny, not a cause of it. This perspective challenges simplistic critiques of conformity. What might appear as compliance was often adaptation. Appearance offered a way to navigate expectations with minimal conflict, protecting both self-esteem and social standing. By acknowledging this, the narrative shifts away from blame. The focus moves from individual choices to the conditions that made those choices necessary. Appearance was not a distraction from responsibility, it was part of managing it. In recognizing the function of this armor, a deeper empathy emerges. The mirror reflects not vanity, but resilience. Each carefully chosen detail represents an effort to face the world with dignity, even when internal reserves are low. This understanding reveals how deeply judgment shaped daily life. The need to appear capable and composed was not optional. It was woven into the fabric of routine, influencing decisions large and small. Through this lens, appearance becomes a language one used to communicate reliability, care, and worth in a society quick to evaluate and slow to understand. It was not about perfection, but about protection. What children carried to school each morning became more than food. Lunches turned into quiet statements, inspected not only by teachers and classmates, but by other parents as well. Wrapped sandwiches, carefully chosen fruit, and neatly packed containers communicated effort and care. In this environment, a lunchbox was never just a lunchbox. It was evidence. The act of preparing lunch happened early, often before the day had fully begun. Decisions were made quickly, yet each choice carried weight. What to include, how much, and how it looked all mattered. The goal was not only nourishment, but reassurance that nothing had been overlooked, that standards were being met. Even when time was limited, appearance and balance were expected. Comparison was unavoidable. Children noticed differences, and adults anticipated those observations. A simple sandwich could invite assumptions about attention or resources. More elaborate meals suggested dedication and competence. These interpretations were rarely stated openly, but they shaped perceptions nonetheless. The lunchroom became an extension of the social world outside it. This pressure was amplified by advice columns and advertisements that offered guidance on what an ideal lunch should contain. Lists of recommended foods and portion sizes implied that there was a correct way to do things. Deviating from these suggestions risked criticism or self-doubt. Convenience was framed as a shortcut rather than a practical necessity. The emotional stakes of lunch preparation were disproportionate to the task itself. A forgotten item or uneaten food could feel like a personal failure. When children returned home with complaints or leftovers, questions arose immediately. Was the food wrong? Was not enough care shown? These moments reinforced the idea that responsibility extended far beyond the kitchen. Lunches also reflected broader anxieties about health, behavior, and social acceptance. Food choices were tied to concerns about energy, attention, and appearance. A well-packed lunch promised not only a fed child, but a successful day at school. This belief placed enormous responsibility on a single daily ritual. Time constraints complicated everything. Preparing lunches had to fit into an already crowded morning routine. Multitasking was essential. Bread was spread while listening for footsteps, fruit was sliced while checking the clock. Efficiency mattered, but so did presentation. Balancing these demands required constant adjustment. Children's preferences added another layer of complexity. What was packed was not always what was eaten. Navigating tastes, habits, and social influences required guesswork. A rejected lunch felt like wasted effort, but also like a missed opportunity to meet expectations. The next day brought another attempt to get it right. The lunchbox also carried messages about conformity. Foods that stood out too much risked attention, while overly plain meals risked judgment. The safest option often lay somewhere in the middle. This balancing act mirrored broader social pressures, teaching children early on how to blend in without disappearing. Economic realities influenced these choices, though they were rarely acknowledged openly. Access to certain foods or packaging varied, yet standards remained uniform. This disconnect added to the quiet stress surrounding lunch preparation. Effort was expected regardless of circumstance. Despite its significance, the work behind lunch preparation remained invisible. There were no compliments for consistency, only silence when expectations were met. Recognition came only when something went wrong. This imbalance reinforced vigilance rather than confidence. Over time, lunches became symbolic of a larger pattern. Small daily tasks carried moral weight, transforming care into performance. The routine repetition of packing a lunch was less about creativity and more about reliability. Showing up every day with something acceptable mattered more than excellence. This dynamic shaped relationships. Children learned to associate care with compliance to norms. Parents learned to measure success through absence of criticism. The lunchbox became a quiet mediator between home and school, carrying expectations back and forth. Moments of relief were rare but meaningful. A positive comment from a child or teacher could validate weeks of effort. These moments lingered, offering reassurance that the invisible work was noticed, even if briefly. Understanding lunches as a silent measure of success reveals how deeply judgment permeated daily life. What seemed like a simple task was loaded with meaning. It connected nourishment to identity, routine to worth. By reframing this ritual, its true nature becomes clearer. Lunch preparation was not about perfection, but persistence. It required attention, adaptability, and resilience. The value lay not in the contents of the box, but in the consistency of care it represented. This perspective shifts the narrative away from critique and toward empathy. The pressure surrounding lunches was not self-imposed. It was shaped by cultural expectations and social comparison. Recognizing this allows the focus to move from outcomes to effort. In the end, the lunchbox tells a quiet story. It speaks of early mornings, careful choices, and the desire to protect children from judgment. It carries not just food, but intention. And in that intention lies the real measure of success, one rarely seen, but deeply felt. Breakfast was often described as the most important meal of the day, but in practice, it rarely resembled the calm, nourishing ritual depicted in popular imagery. Instead, it functioned as a logistical challenge, squeezed between deadlines and distractions. The goal was not enjoyment or connection, but momentum. Getting everyone fed enough to function was considered success. Time shaped every decision. There was little opportunity to linger at the table or savor food. Meals were chosen for speed and reliability rather than preference or nutrition. Toast, cereal, and quickly prepared items dominated the morning landscape because they fit the rhythm of urgency. The priority was minimizing resistance and maximizing efficiency. The kitchen table became a temporary staging area rather than a gathering place. Plates were set and cleared rapidly. Conversations, if they happened at all, were fragmented and practical. Instructions replaced storytelling. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation of what came next rather than presence in the moment. Children's appetites varied widely in the early hours, creating additional tension. Some resisted eating altogether, while others needed encouragement to finish quickly. Managing these differences required negotiation and compromise. Forcing calm into these interactions was difficult when the clock dictated the pace. Spills and messes were common, adding stress to an already compressed schedule. Cleaning up took time that was not available, yet leaving disorder behind felt unacceptable. Decisions had to be made instantly about what could be ignored and what required immediate attention. These judgments were rarely straightforward. The idea of a balanced, carefully planned breakfast often collided with reality. Nutritional ideals promoted by media suggested variety and completeness, yet the morning routine allowed for neither. This gap between expectation and possibility created guilt, even when children were adequately fed. The pressure to do better lingered. Breakfast also carried symbolic weight. It represented preparation for the day ahead. A child leaving the house without eating enough felt like a failure of foresight. This belief magnified the importance of the meal beyond its actual role, increasing anxiety around an already challenging task. Eating habits became intertwined with discipline. Finishing breakfast on time was treated as part of readiness, reinforcing the idea that compliance mattered. These lessons were subtle but persistent, shaping how children understood responsibility and routine. Despite its challenges, breakfast offered moments of care. A preferred bowl, a familiar routine, or a brief shared laugh could soften the urgency. These moments were fleeting but meaningful. They reminded everyone involved that connection was still possible, even under pressure. The emotional labor involved in managing breakfast was significant. Maintaining patience while monitoring time required constant self-regulation. Frustration had to be controlled, encouragement delivered evenly, and urgency masked with reassurance. This balance was difficult to sustain. Cultural narratives often failed to reflect this reality. Images of families enjoying leisurely breakfasts created an ideal that felt distant from lived experience. These portrayals suggested that calm mornings were attainable with the right attitude, ignoring structural constraints like school schedules and work demands. As a result, breakfast became a site of comparison. When reality fell short of the ideal, self-judgment followed. The focus remained on individual effort rather than on the system that made such ideals unrealistic. Over time, the routine hardened into habit. Expectations adjusted to the pace, and the sense of urgency became normalized. Breakfast was no longer seen as rushed. It was simply how mornings worked. This normalization masked the strain involved. The language used around breakfast reinforced its utilitarian role. Phrases emphasized readiness and energy rather than enjoyment. The meal was framed as fuel, not as an experience. This framing shaped how it was approached and valued. Children learned quickly what was expected. Eating efficiently became part of the morning script. Preferences were negotiated within narrow limits. The goal was not satisfaction, but compliance with time constraints. In this context, nourishment took on a broader meaning. It extended beyond food to include emotional reassurance and stability. Providing breakfast was a way to offer care in the midst of hurry, even if the form that care took was imperfect. Understanding breakfast as survival rather than nourishment reframes its role. It was not a failure of intention, but a response to constraint. The focus was on getting through the morning intact rather than achieving an ideal. This perspective allows for greater empathy. The rushed nature of breakfast was not a sign of neglect, but of prioritization under pressure. Choices were made quickly because they had to be. By recognizing the realities shaping this routine, judgment gives way to understanding. Breakfast was never meant to carry the weight placed upon it. It became symbolic because it occurred at the intersection of care and urgency. In the end, the morning meal tells a quiet story of adaptation. It reflects the ways people adjust rituals to fit demanding schedules. What mattered most was not the menu, but the effort to prepare children for the day ahead with the resources available. Seen through this lens, breakfast becomes an act of resilience. It represents persistence in the face of constraint, care expressed through consistency rather than perfection. And in that consistency lies its true value. Neighborhoods were often presented as places of comfort and belonging, where familiar faces and shared routines created a sense of security. On the surface, they appeared friendly and supportive. Yet beneath this image existed a subtle form of observation that shaped behavior. Everyday interactions carried an undercurrent of evaluation, turning ordinary spaces into stages where expectations were reinforced. Mornings brought these dynamics into focus. As doors opened and families stepped outside, brief encounters took place on sidewalks and driveways. These moments were short, but they mattered. A passing glance could register clothing choices, punctuality, and composure. Even when no words were exchanged, impressions formed quickly. School drop-offs intensified this awareness. Cars lined up, children gathered, and adults exchanged polite smiles. The setting encouraged comparison. Who arrived early? Who seemed rushed? Who looked prepared? These observations were rarely intentional, yet they accumulated over time, shaping perceptions and self-awareness. The power of this quiet surveillance lay in its subtlety. There were no explicit rules or enforcers. Instead, norms were communicated through repetition and reaction. Approval appeared as friendliness and inclusion, while deviation risked distance or quiet judgment. This dynamic encouraged conformity without the need for confrontation. Routine played a key role. Seeing the same people at the same times created a shared rhythm. Falling out of sync was noticeable. A late arrival or an uncharacteristic absence prompted questions, even if they were never voiced. Regularity became a marker of reliability. The presence of children heightened scrutiny. Parenting choices were interpreted as reflections of values and competence. Small details, whether a child's clothes were neat, whether they seemed calm or upset, were read as indicators of household stability. These interpretations were often unfair, but they persisted. Privacy blurred in these environments. While homes offered physical separation, routines unfolded publicly. The boundary between personal life and communal space was thin. This made it difficult to escape observation entirely, even during moments of vulnerability. Conversations reinforced these dynamics. Casual remarks about schedules, habits, or appearances carried implicit standards. Compliments and concerns alike communicated expectations. Over time, these exchanges shaped a shared understanding of what was considered acceptable. The impact of surveillance was not uniform. Some felt comforted by familiarity, while others experienced constant self-monitoring. The difference often depended on how closely one's life aligned with prevailing norms. For those who fit easily, the neighborhood felt supportive. For others, it felt watchful. This watchfulness influenced behavior in subtle ways. Choices were adjusted to avoid standing out. Clothing, routines, and interactions were shaped by anticipation of how they might be perceived. Authenticity was tempered by caution. The absence of overt conflict made this dynamic difficult to challenge. Because judgment was rarely expressed directly, it was easy to dismiss concerns as imagined. This uncertainty intensified self-doubt. Was the pressure real or self-imposed? The lack of clarity made it harder to resist. Media narratives often celebrated close-knit neighborhoods without acknowledging this complexity. Community was portrayed as inherently positive, ignoring how conformity could be enforced quietly. These portrayals reinforced the idea that any discomfort stemmed from individual insecurity rather than structural dynamics. The surveillance extended beyond mornings. Afternoon pickups, weekend errands, and community events all contributed to the sense of being seen. Over time, this constant visibility shaped identity. One learned how to be perceived as dependable, organized, and appropriate. Children absorbed these cues early. They learned which behaviors attracted approval and which invited attention. These lessons shaped their understanding of belonging and difference, reinforcing the importance of fitting in. Despite its challenges, neighborhood surveillance also offered moments of connection. Familiarity could lead to mutual support, shared routines, and collective care. The same awareness that enabled judgment could also enable assistance. This duality made the dynamic complex rather than purely negative. Yet the cost of constant observation remained. The effort required to maintain appearances was ongoing. There was little room for deviation or rest. The expectation of consistency left little space for change or vulnerability. Understanding neighborhoods as spaces of quiet surveillance reframes their role. They were not neutral backdrops, but active participants in shaping behavior. The social environment influenced choices as much as personal preference. This perspective encourages a more nuanced view of community. Belonging came with conditions, and acceptance required adherence to shared norms. These conditions were rarely articulated, yet deeply felt. By acknowledging this, the narrative shifts from idealization to realism. Neighborhoods were places of both support and pressure, connection and constraint. Recognizing both aspects allows for a deeper understanding of daily life within them. In the end, these spaces shaped mornings as much as kitchens did. The act of stepping outside carried social weight. Every departure and arrival became part of a larger pattern of observation and interpretation. Seen through this lens, the neighborhood becomes more than a setting. It becomes a system, one that rewards conformity and quietly discourages difference. Understanding this system reveals why ordinary routines carried such emotional significance. This awareness opens space for empathy. The vigilance required to navigate these spaces was not a personal failing, but a response to social dynamics. Recognizing this allows judgment to soften and understanding to grow. What appeared as casual familiarity often masked deeper expectations. By bringing these dynamics into focus, the myth of effortless community begins to unravel, revealing the complex reality beneath. Housework was often described as routine, even simple, yet its true nature was far from easy. It was a cycle without a clear beginning or end, repeating itself daily with little acknowledgement. Tasks blended into one another: cleaning, organizing, repairing, preparing, forming a continuous stream of responsibility that rarely paused. The work was necessary, yet its completion was temporary. No matter how thoroughly it was done, it always returned. The physical demands were significant. Floors needed sweeping, dishes accumulated, laundry piled up. These tasks required time and energy, often performed while standing, bending, lifting, and moving from room to room. The body absorbed the strain quietly. Fatigue was expected, not questioned. There was no finish line, only maintenance. What made this labor especially heavy was its invisibility. When housework was done well, it went unnoticed. Clean spaces were treated as the default, not as evidence of effort. Recognition appeared only when something was missed. This imbalance shaped how the work was perceived, minimizing its value while magnifying its absence. Time pressure intensified the burden. Housework had to fit into the spaces between other obligations. It was done early in the morning, late at night, or in fragmented moments throughout the day. Rarely did it receive uninterrupted attention. This fragmentation made the work feel endless, as progress was constantly interrupted. Cultural narratives reinforced this invisibility. Media often portrayed domestic labor as effortless, even enjoyable. Images showed tidy homes maintained with ease, suggesting that success required only the right attitude or tools. These portrayals erased the labor involved, turning work into background scenery rather than central effort. The expectation of constant readiness added another layer of strain. Homes were expected to appear presentable at all times. This meant anticipating messes and preventing them before they became visible. The pressure to maintain order created a state of ongoing alertness, where relaxation felt risky. Housework was also emotionally demanding. It required planning, prioritization, and decision-making. What needed attention first? What could wait? These judgments were made repeatedly, often without input or support. The mental load was as heavy as the physical tasks, yet even harder to see. The repetition of tasks contributed to a sense of stagnation. Unlike work with visible milestones or long-term projects, domestic labor rarely showed progress. Each day reset the cycle. This lack of visible advancement made it difficult to feel accomplished, even when the workload was immense. Expectations around cleanliness and order were shaped by social norms rather than necessity. Standards varied, yet judgment remained consistent. Falling short of an ideal invited criticism, while meeting it brought little acknowledgement. This dynamic reinforced vigilance rather than satisfaction. Housework often absorbed emotional overflow from other parts of life. Stress, worry, and frustration found expression in cleaning and organizing. While this provided temporary control, it also blurred the line between coping and obligation. The work became both a task and a response to pressure. Children's activities amplified the workload. Messes were constant and unpredictable. Cleaning was not just about restoring order, but about adapting to ongoing disruption. This required patience and flexibility, qualities that were rarely recognized as skills. The lack of clear boundaries made it difficult to rest. Even moments of pause were accompanied by awareness of unfinished tasks. The home itself became a reminder of work yet to be done. This constant presence of responsibility limited true downtime. Despite its challenges, housework was framed as a natural duty rather than a form of labor. This framing justified its lack of recognition and support. Because it was expected, it was not valued. This expectation normalized exhaustion and minimized complaint. Over time, this invisibility shaped self-perception. Effort became internalized rather than shared. Success was measured by absence of chaos rather than by personal well-being. This narrow definition of achievement left little room for pride or rest. The contrast between public and private labor deepened the strain. Work done outside the home often came with schedules, compensation, and acknowledgement. Domestic labor offered none of these markers. Its importance was implied, but its cost was ignored. Yet within this relentless cycle, there was meaning. Housework sustained daily life. It created spaces where people could function, rest, and connect. Its impact was indirect but essential. The challenge lay not in its value, but in its invisibility. Recognizing housework as labor changes the narrative. It shifts focus from outcome to effort, from expectation to cost. This recognition does not reduce the workload, but it reframes it as worthy of respect and support. Understanding the relentlessness of this work reveals why fatigue was so common. It was not a failure of efficiency or attitude, but a consequence of carrying a continuous, undervalued responsibility. The work demanded consistency without offering closure. By bringing this labor into view, the myth of effortless domesticity begins to dissolve. What appeared simple was sustained by constant effort. What looked natural required planning, strength, and endurance. This reframing invites empathy. It acknowledges that maintaining a household was not a background task, but a central pillar of daily life. The absence of recognition was not a reflection of insignificance, but of oversight. In the end, housework tells a quiet story of persistence. It speaks of days structured around care, maintenance, and responsibility. Its repetition was not meaningless. It was foundational. Understanding this allows appreciation to replace dismissal. The labor may have been invisible, but its impact was not. It shaped routines, supported families, and defined daily existence. Seeing it clearly honors the effort that sustained ordinary life, even when that effort went unspoken. Unexpected visits carried a unique kind of tension. A knock at the door, a voice calling from outside, or the sudden appearance of a neighbor at the window could instantly shift the atmosphere inside a home. These moments disrupted not just routines, but the sense of control that had been carefully maintained. What was private became visible without warning. The fear was not rooted in hostility, but in exposure. Homes were expected to be ready at all times, reflecting order, cleanliness, and composure. A surprise visit threatened this expectation. It risked revealing unfinished tasks, cluttered corners, or emotional fatigue that had not yet been concealed. The possibility of being seen unprepared carried emotional weight. This tension was shaped by social norms that blurred the line between friendliness and evaluation. Casual drop-ins were framed as neighborly gestures, yet they functioned as informal inspections. Even when intentions were kind, the effect was the same. The visit created an opportunity for comparison and judgment, whether or not it was consciously exercised. Preparation became a constant background activity. Rooms were kept in a state of partial readiness, surfaces cleared, and personal items stored away. This readiness limited relaxation. Comfort was often postponed in favor of maintaining appearances. The home became less a private refuge, and more a space on display. The sound of the doorbell triggered immediate calculation. Was the house presentable enough? Was there time to adjust something quickly? These thoughts occurred in seconds, accompanied by physical reactions, quickened movements, shallow breaths, focused attention. The body responded before the mind fully caught up. Children amplified this unpredictability. Their activities left visible traces: toys, papers, spills that were difficult to manage completely. Managing these traces became part of daily vigilance. The fear was not of mess itself, but of what mess symbolized to others. Cultural narratives encouraged openness and hospitality, complicating this dynamic. Refusing entry or asking someone to return later risked appearing unfriendly. This expectation removed the ability to control access to personal space. Privacy became conditional rather than assumed. The emotional cost of this vigilance was cumulative. Constant anticipation of inspection created low-level stress that lingered even in quiet moments. Relaxation felt temporary and fragile. The home, meant to offer rest, became another side of performance. The fear of inspection extended beyond cleanliness. It included emotional presentation. Being seen tired, irritable, or overwhelmed felt unacceptable. Visitors expected calm and composure, regardless of what the day had brought. This expectation reinforced emotional suppression. Media portrayals reinforced the idea of the always-ready home. Images showed interiors that were perpetually tidy, welcoming, and serene. These representations suggested that readiness was a baseline, not an achievement. When reality fell short, self-judgment followed. The social hierarchy within communities intensified this pressure. Some visitors carried more perceived authority than others. Their opinions mattered more, their judgments felt heavier. The fear was not evenly distributed. It was shaped by relationships and status. Over time, this vigilance shaped behavior. Choices were made to minimize risk rather than maximize comfort. Furniture arrangements, storage solutions, and daily habits were influenced by the need to appear prepared. The home's layout reflected anticipation rather than preference. The absence of inspection did not eliminate the fear. Even when visits were rare, the possibility remained. This uncertainty kept vigilance active. The home was never fully off duty. Despite this, moments of connection did occur. Some visits offered genuine support or companionship. Yet even these positive interactions were colored by preparation and self-monitoring. Authenticity was filtered through expectation. Understanding this fear reframes the meaning of surprise visits. They were not simply social gestures, but tests of readiness imposed without consent. The pressure they created was not imagined. It was embedded in social norms that valued appearance over privacy. This dynamic reveals how deeply evaluation penetrated daily life. The home, often idealized as a sanctuary, was subject to external standards. The right to imperfection was limited. Recognizing this allows empathy to replace judgment. The effort to maintain readiness was not obsession, but adaptation. It was a response to a culture that blurred boundaries between personal and public life. The fear of inspection also highlights the imbalance of expectations. Responsibility for readiness fell disproportionately on one person. The labor of anticipation was unevenly distributed, increasing its burden. By acknowledging this, the narrative shifts. What once seemed like overconcern becomes understandable caution. The vigilance was not a personal failing, but a rational response to constant evaluation. This perspective invites reconsideration of hospitality norms. It questions the assumption that access should always be granted and readiness always maintained. It suggests that privacy deserves protection, not justification. In the end, the fear of sudden inspection reveals a deeper truth about daily life under scrutiny. It shows how ordinary spaces were shaped by the possibility of judgment. The knock at the door was never just a knock, it was a reminder of expectations waiting outside. Understanding this transforms how these moments are seen. They were not interruptions, but reflections of a broader system that valued appearance over ease. Recognizing this system allows space for compassion where pressure once prevailed. Printed pages carried more weight than they appeared to. Glossy covers and carefully staged photographs entered homes quietly, yet their influence lingered long after the pages were turned. These publications presented an idealized version of daily life that felt authoritative, aspirational, and relentlessly polished. Each image suggested effortlessness. Kitchens gleamed without visible labor. Meals appeared balanced, colorful, and perfectly arranged. Children smiled without signs of exhaustion or resistance. Adults looked calm, rested, and satisfied. The message was subtle but clear. This level of order was normal, attainable, and expected. The power of these images came from repetition. Month after month, the same themes appeared. Cleanliness equaled virtue. Organization signaled competence. Beauty implied discipline. Over time, these associations embedded themselves into the reader's perception of success. Articles framed perfection as practical. Headlines promised simple steps, quick fixes, and foolproof systems. 10-minute dinners. Effortless cleaning routines. Morning schedules that guaranteed serenity. The language implied that failure to achieve these results stemmed from poor planning, not unrealistic standards. This framing shifted responsibility inward. When reality did not match the image, self-doubt followed. The gap between lived experience and printed promise created quiet frustration. Instead of questioning the standard, individuals questioned themselves. Media narratives rarely acknowledged exhaustion. Fatigue was absent from these pages. Messes were temporary inconveniences, easily resolved with the right product or attitude. Emotional strain was either invisible or reframed as a solvable flaw. Advertising reinforced this illusion. Products were positioned as solutions not just to tasks, but to identity. The right appliance suggested efficiency. The right detergent implied moral responsibility. The right lipstick signaled composure regardless of circumstance. These messages blurred boundaries between consumption and self-worth. Buying became a pathway to belonging. Owning the right items promised alignment with the ideal life depicted in print. Falling short felt like personal inadequacy rather than economic or structural limitation. Comparison became inevitable. Readers measured their homes, routines, and appearances against curated images. This comparison rarely favored reality. The result was a cycle of aspiration and disappointment that fueled both consumption and self-criticism. The authority of print amplified its impact. These publications were treated as experts, offering guidance on everything from parenting to decor. Their tone was confident, instructional, and reassuring. Questioning their validity felt unnecessary or even defiant. The absence of diversity further narrowed the definition of success. One lifestyle dominated the pages. One standard of order, beauty, and behavior prevailed. Alternative experiences were excluded, rendering them invisible or invalid. Time constraints were overlooked. Articles assumed unlimited energy and uninterrupted hours. Tasks were presented as manageable when isolated, ignoring the cumulative load of daily responsibilities. This simplification minimized the reality of constant demands. The emotional labor behind appearances went unacknowledged. Smiles, patience, and calm were expected outcomes, not efforts. Maintaining composure was framed as natural rather than exhausting. This narrative extended beyond the home. Public interactions were influenced by internalized standards. Individuals carried these expectations into social settings, reinforcing the performance of perfection. The disconnect between image and reality created internal conflict. Knowing the images were staged did not eliminate their influence. Awareness did not equal immunity. The ideals remained powerful despite skepticism. Some readers internalized these messages deeply, striving to replicate what they saw. Others experienced quiet resistance, recognizing the impossibility of the standard. Yet even resistance required energy, as deviation risked judgment. Media rarely depicted failure without resolution. Mistakes were temporary and instructive. Chaos was a prelude to triumph. This structure left little room for ongoing struggle without redemption. The lack of honest representation narrowed emotional vocabulary. Frustration, resentment, and overwhelm were underrepresented. Without reflection in media, these feelings felt isolating and inappropriate. Over time, this environment shaped memory. Past experiences were reinterpreted through the lens of idealized imagery. Ordinary moments felt lacking in retrospect, overshadowed by what they were supposed to look like. The cumulative effect was subtle but pervasive. Standards elevated quietly. Expectations hardened. What was once exceptional became baseline. Understanding this influence reveals how perfection was manufactured rather than discovered. It was curated, edited, and repeated until it felt real. Recognizing the construction of these ideals allows distance. It reframes comparison as unfair and self-judgment as misplaced. It highlights the gap between representation and reality. This perspective does not diminish the appeal of beauty or order. It contextualizes them. It acknowledges that images are products, not mirrors. By questioning the authority of these narratives, space opens for alternative definitions of success. Definitions grounded in sustainability rather than spectacle. The legacy of these publications persists. Their influence echoes in modern media, where images travel faster and expectations spread wider. The patterns remain familiar. Revisiting this era with critical awareness offers insight into how ideals are shaped. It underscores the importance of representation that includes imperfection, effort, and rest. The realization that perfection was manufactured does not erase its impact. But it offers clarity. It shifts blame away from individuals and towards systems that profited from aspiration. In recognizing this, the narrative changes. What once felt like personal failure becomes evidence of unrealistic standards. What felt like falling short becomes surviving within constraint. This understanding restores dignity to ordinary experience. It validates the unseen labor behind daily life. It affirms that worth is not measured by alignment with printed ideals. The pages promised perfection, but reality held complexity. In acknowledging that difference, authenticity gains ground. And authenticity, unlike perfection, does not require constant performance. By the end of the day, when the dishes were stacked to dry and the house finally felt quiet, what remained was not the glossy image sold in magazines or television ads. What remained was a woman who had endured. The true story of motherhood in the 1950s was not one of effortless grace or constant happiness, but of persistence in the face of endless demands. Survival, not perfection, was the real and unspoken measure of success. The culture of the time insisted that motherhood should look serene. Advertisements showed spotless kitchens, smiling children, and mothers who appeared fulfilled by every repetitive task. These images suggested that if a woman worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, and maintained the right attitude, she could achieve a flawless domestic life. But real days did not unfold according to advertisements. They unfolded with spills, arguments, fatigue, and moments of quiet doubt that had no place in public conversation. What made survival such an achievement was the sheer weight of expectations placed on mothers. They were expected to be educators, nurses, cooks, cleaners, emotional anchors, and social representatives of their families, all without visible strain. There was little room to admit exhaustion. To struggle openly was often interpreted as personal failure rather than a natural response to overwhelming responsibility. Endurance became invisible labor, performed daily and rarely acknowledged. Emotionally, this endurance took a toll. Many mothers carried a constant fear that they were not doing enough or not doing it well enough. Even when the house was clean and the children were fed, there was always the sense that something could have been improved. A better meal, a calmer response, a neater appearance. Perfection was presented as attainable, which made anything less feel like a shortcoming. In reality, the standard itself was impossible. Yet within this pressure, mothers developed quiet forms of resilience. They learned how to prioritize what truly mattered, even if they could not say it out loud. Some days, getting everyone through the day without disaster was the victory. Some days, holding back frustration or finding a brief moment of calm was enough. These small triumphs rarely appeared in stories or photos, but they formed the backbone of daily life. Survival also meant emotional adaptation. Mothers learned to suppress parts of themselves that did not fit the ideal image. Ambition, anger, boredom, and even sadness were often pushed aside in favor of a pleasant exterior. This emotional discipline required constant effort. Maintaining the appearance of contentment, especially when feeling overwhelmed, was itself a form of labor. It demanded self-control, restraint, and sacrifice that went largely unnoticed. The children, too, were part of this complex equation. Mothers were expected to shape them into polite, successful members of society, reflecting well on the family and the community. Any misbehavior was often seen as a reflection of maternal competence. This made everyday parenting choices feel high stakes. Correcting a child's behavior was not just about guidance, it was about protecting one's reputation and sense of worth. Over time, many mothers redefined success in private ways. While public standards emphasized perfection, private standards focused on endurance. Getting up the next morning, continuing the routine, and caring for others despite fatigue became a quiet form of strength. These women rarely described themselves as strong, yet their lives were built on sustained effort over years, not moments. The contrast between public image and private reality created a kind of silent solidarity. While mothers might compete outwardly, they also recognized the shared strain beneath the surface. A tired glance, a brief conversation, or a knowing smile could communicate what words could not. In these small exchanges, there was acknowledgement, this was hard, and continuing anyway mattered. Looking back, it becomes clear that the real achievement of 1950s motherhood was not matching an ideal, but enduring a system that left little room for honesty or rest. These women navigated a world that demanded everything from them while offering limited recognition in return. Their success was measured not in flawless homes or cheerful appearances, but in the fact that families continued, children grew, and life moved forward. Understanding this reframes the narrative of the era. Instead of seeing mothers as passive figures in a nostalgic scene, we can recognize them as active participants in a demanding social structure. Their lives were shaped by constraints, yet within those constraints, they exercised resilience, creativity, and determination. Survival was not a lesser goal than perfection. It was the only realistic one. In the end, the myth of perfect motherhood tells us more about cultural expectations than about real women. The reality was complex, messy, and emotionally layered. Acknowledging this does not diminish the past. It honors it. It recognizes that behind every polished image was a person who showed up every day, did the work, and kept going. And in that persistence lies the true legacy of motherhood in the 1950s. When we look back at this era with clearer eyes, the story of 1950s motherhood becomes less about nostalgia and more about recognition. It reminds us that behind every carefully staged image was a real human experience shaped by pressure, responsibility, and quiet endurance. Understanding this history helps us question the standards we inherit and the ideals we continue to pass on. It encourages empathy not only for the women of the past, but for anyone who has ever felt measured against an unrealistic image of what they should be. By acknowledging survival as the true achievement, we replace judgment with understanding and illusion with truth. Thank you for spending this time with us and exploring this story together. If you found this perspective meaningful, do not forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden histories and untold realities. Until next time, take care, and we will see you in the next episode.